When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. Knowing you could be saving money for the things you really want is a great feeling. Talk to a State Farm agent today to learn how you can choose to bundle and save with the Personal Price Plan. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices are based on rating plans that vary by state. Coverage options are selected by the customer. Availability, amount of discounts and savings, and eligibility vary by state.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. As this is an episode of our Seat at the Table series, I am joined by two wonderful friends and fellow podcasters, Elsa and Chris of Flat Pack History of Sweden, but also they have started a new podcast venture, and they'll tell you about that more in just a moment. But thank y'all so much for joining me for another Seat at the Table episode.
Thank you, and thank you for having us again. It's always a pleasure to speak to you and to learn more about the presidents and the members of cabinet.
Yeah, and especially for us, like you, who we do so much research for our podcast, it's fun coming in not knowing a single word or even name about what we're going to be talking about. So.
Yes, so my guests today have asked to not be told who we're talking about, so we'll reveal that in a moment. Of course, our listeners already know, but I wanted to give y'all an opportunity first to talk about your original podcast and then to talk about your new podcast, which I have been greatly enjoying thus far.
Thank you. So, yeah, our original podcast, A Flat Pack History of Sweden, is a podcast about Swedish history. The name Flat Pack, obviously a bit of a pun on the famous IKEA furniture shop. Our idea is that if you listen to us, then eventually you'll be able to have all the pieces of your flat pack to put together Swedish history. And yeah, we go chronologically through history. We come out every other weekend. And yeah, we started a couple of years ago with the first people arriving in Sweden. And now we've gotten up to the Renaissance, late 1500s, and on the way there's been Vikings and more wars with Russia than I think I can count. And when it's not wars with Russia, it's wars with Denmark. That's the running theme of foreign policy in Swedish history.
Yeah, it's always nice to get on with your neighbors like that.
Yeah.
And then we started a new podcast literally just this year, which is called Kingdom or Kingdom, depending on how you want to stress the last part of the word, because it's also a bit of a pun, because if you put the two dots over the DOM at the end, it becomes the Swedish word dum, which means judge or to judge. And so we are, just like we're doing today with a cabinet member, we go through all the kings. It's so far only been kings, but we're going to get up to some queens and regents too and judge them on some fun categories. You know, that people are familiar with the broad strokes of them if they've listened to obviously this and Rex Factor and Totalis Rankium and all of those. So we look at their fighting ability, how crazy they were, and there's a flat pack category to see how well they built up the kingdom. So yeah, lots of different stuff going on.
Well, I can say personally, I've learned so much about Swedish history from the two of you. So thank you so much for all that you do. And for our listeners, I highly encourage you. So many folks think of Sweden and they think of Vikings, and yes, and there's so much more. So I highly encourage folks to check out both of your podcasts, and I will share information about both of them on my social media around the release of this episode. Speaking of, because we've got quite a bit to talk about, because we are going to be covering, and as I did the last time that y'all were on, I found somebody with a connection to Sweden.
Excellent.
The person we're going to be talking about is this little known figure in history called John Quincy Adams.
Yeah. Oh, I was hoping it was going to be John Quincy Adams. He's possibly not that I know much about him, but he's one of my favorite figures, mainly because in some parts of his life, I wish I was him.
Chris has talked about little else for the last couple of days of like, I hope we get John Quincy Adams. I hope we get John Quincy Adams. Because also you did something last year that, means that you've been quite close to John Quincy.
Well, exactly. And we maybe saved it to a bit later, but I've been to where he was born and where he lived very recently.
Nice.
So we'll get to talk about that, I'm sure.
Well, after this episode, you will know quite a bit more about him. But since, of course, spoiler alert, he's going to become president and he's going to have his own series for the narrative. So what I'm going to do here, what I try and do with presidents who we cover on Seat at the Table, I do have to, of course, talk about their life before and after the presidency, the cabinet. But I try and, just give the details that we need to know and then really focus in on his time as the cabinet member. So with that said, let's dive in. So John Quincy was born the second child of some other no-name folks in American history, John and Abigail Adams, on July 11, 1767, in a wood frame cottage a mile from the village of Braintree. And yes, you can, like Chris said, you can go to that house, and I've been there myself. I love it.
It's such a cool place, and especially when I guess a lot of this this time in American history where it's these places are being built for the very first time. They're not necessarily building things that are going to last for very long, but these are areas and places that actually have done, and even little things. The police cars there say like the city of presidents or something like that, because they have this really strong and great connection to this time period.
Absolutely. And they take great pride in all the members of the Adams family, John Quincy, but then also Abigail. We'll talk about Louisa today. And at the end, we'll talk about a few more names. But for now, let's start with John Quincy. So through his mother, John could trace his Quincy heritage back to England to the age of William the Conqueror. And that side of the family came over to the Massachusetts Bay Colony shortly after it was established, and they had maintained a family estate on Mount Wollaston since 1635. Then on the Adams side of the family, they had arrived in Massachusetts in 1632 and served the Braintree community in various ways, with Adamses serving as sheriffs, selectmen, and deacons. So this very much both sides of the family integrated into this community.
Yeah, and they're getting important jobs and respected positions in society right from the very beginning too.
Absolutely, and we'll see how that impacts John Quincy. But we also want to mention John Quincy's older sister, who is named Abigail, but she's known to the family as Nabby. She had been born in 1765, and then a few years after John's birth, two more siblings joined the family, Charles in 1770 and Thomas Boylston in 1772. Now, the Adamses owned what John Quincy's biographer James Traub describes as, quote, a modest 10-acre farm. And that sounds like, it's like, oh, you've got 10 acres. But you also think about the time they had to be more self-sufficient. And so they needed more space to be able to farm. And definitely there were folks who had larger farms, but still doing pretty well.
Yeah, I know we looked at, and it's one of those things where you sort of only use the term acres or hectares when you talk about this sort of size of thing. I think we did one in Kingdom recently. I'm not sure if we've released it yet, but we said that the kings and queen donated 10 hectares to this abbey. And I was like, how big is that? It's hard to quantify. But yeah, it's sort of, that is the amount that a normal family could provide for themselves using.
Absolutely.
Comcast is committed to bringing access to the internet to all Americans, including rural communities across the country, like Sussex County, Delaware.
We were being left behind. Everybody around us seemed to have internet, but we did not. High-speed internet is one of those good things that we needed to help us move our farming, our small businesses, our recreation forward.
Learn more about how we're bringing our next-generation network to more people across the country at ComcastCorporation.com/investment in America.
Now, the family's income would primarily come from John Adams's law practice, but the farm allowed them, like we said, to be self-sufficient for most of their material needs. However, you may or may not be aware of this, John Quincy's father was not content to just be a lawyer and a farmer, because as the disputes between the British North American colonies and the government back in London heated up, John threw himself into politics, as discussed, of course, in his pre-presidency episodes. And we won't go too much into John's career. Again, we've already covered that. But there are some things in his career that we need to know because they intersect. So in 1774, Adams was named as a delegate to the First Continental Congress and left for Philadelphia, which was the first of what would come to be numerous bouts of separation from his family. So that was one thing about public service, and especially at that level in these days, it wasn't like they could just catch a train or hop on a plane and go home. When they left, they stayed gone for a while. And because of this, as noted by Traub, quote, John Quincy Adams would spend his childhood and youth in the company of either his mother or his father, but almost never both. And you got to think about how difficult that would be, just to only have one parent.
Sounds like my childhood. My father sailed at sea. He was a master mariner, so he was home for a lot of time. I had the pleasure of having almost a stay-at-home dad for the periods when he was home, and then he was obviously away. You don't come home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon when you sail at sea. Although they were together sometime. It wasn't like they were completely absent. But actually, when they retired a few years ago, was the first time in a 35-year-long marriage that my parents saw each other for more than 3 months in one go. And my brother and I both went, you're going to be splitting up, right? You're going to figure out
you don't like each other.
Yeah, figure out you don't get this break period from each other. But that was a couple of years ago now, and they've settled into retired life and it's extended that 3-month period. So I sympathize with John Quincy in that respect of maybe having a close relationship to both your parents, but as kind of separate individuals rather than a parent couple.
Absolutely. And, and also that brings up a great point because both of his parents would play a large role in his development. And we see that as we go along. And especially, at this younger age with John being gone to Philadelphia, Abigail, of course, had to take up his education, and she actually employed one of her husband's auto law clerks to work as a tutor for the young John Quincy during his father's absence. But as she was wide-read and knowledgeable in various subjects, Abigail would play a direct role in her son's education. Now, she had the young 7-year-old Johnny read to her from books such as Charles Rollin's Ancient History of the Egyptians, Carthaginians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Medes, and Persians, Macedonians, and Grecians.
A fairy tale for all the family.
Also sounds like your favorite subjects in history. When you're not busy doing Swedish history, you're a great fan of ancient history, Chris.
I did get 3 books about Cicero for Christmas.
Nice. Well, so you would enjoy this light read that the 7-year-old Johnny read.
Like 500 pages or so.
And beyond that, she would not just have him read it to her, she would critique him.
Ooh, that sounds like Nordic parenting to you. It's like, you can do better. That's harsh.
Oh, yes. It was not easy growing up as an Adams. And we note that by October 13, 1774, Johnny wrote his first letter to his father and asserted that, quote, "I hope I grow to be a better boy and that you will have no occasion to be ashamed of me when you return."
Oh, that sounds a little sad.
Well, and what's even sadder, so he wrote this in October 1774. It wouldn't be until 1776 that his father wrote back directly to Johnny.
Oh, wow. I mean, yes, busy dad doing important national things, but also that's a long time.
It's a long time. But in the meantime, and as you said, this was a busy time because war was coming to the colonies, and the Adamses would not just be witnesses, but at times participants in it. So on June 17th, 1775, Abigail Adams and an 8-year-old John Quincy watched the Battle of Bunker Hill from an orchard atop Penn's Hill, which was the highest point in the village of Braintree. So they can see clearly this war is not just some distant conflict, it's right there.
Also another place I went to when I was in the area. So it's like doing a tour of my holiday.
Well, and of course, we're going to bring up Boston as well, because as the oldest son, Johnny was assigned the task of riding the 7 miles into Boston to pick up and drop off any mail for the household. His father returned to the family in late November 1777 with the intent to retire from politics and resume his legal career. But Congress implored him to accept a diplomatic posting to France to replace Silas Deane. Now, when John finally agreed in December to accept the posting, John Quincy, implored his father to let him join him. John refused because Abigail was also wanting her and the rest of the family to accompany John across the Atlantic. He refused that, but he agreed to Johnny coming with him.
Wow, that's not going to create an awkward family dinner atmosphere at all.
Let's see who's going with me. Not you, you. And the two departed under the cloak of darkness on February 15th, 1778, and boarded the Boston, the frigate which would convey them across the Atlantic. Now, this voyage allowed father and son the first opportunity they had had to be alone together for a long time. And the elder Adams was impressed with how Johnny bore himself when the ship was threatened by a British frigate, then went through a torrential storm. So this isn't a pleasant voyage, but he's like, he's holding his own. He's actually holding up under this. And John arranged for his son to be tutored in French by a French doctor aboard the ship during the journey. Now, they arrived in France on March 28, 1778, and a week and a half later, they were in Paris. Now, while John settled into lodgings with Benjamin Franklin, Johnny was enrolled in a local private boarding academy where he was taught French, Latin, drawing, music, fencing, and dancing.
Fencing?
Yeah, sounds like all the skills you need. The people who listen to our podcast will know that I do fencing as well and consider it an important skill to have in life.
And especially if you're going to meet British frigates, and you need to be able to defend yourself.
I mean, I live with a British person and produce 2 podcasts with them. I am never without my sword. Ever.
Do the editing. Do it faster.
Exactly. That's how I run Flat Packing Kingdom.
Well, like Abigail critiquing, you're not editing right. Come on.
Why aren't you editing it in French?
Throw in something about the Medes, please. But the Adamses' time in France would not last long, for a treaty with the French had already been negotiated, and it seemed that there was little for 3 diplomats to do there. It's like just sitting around, okay, well, that's done. What are we doing here? So Adams wrote back to Congress suggesting that only 1 diplomat should remain. Now, when he said that, he meant himself.
Yeah.
But he learned in February 1779 that Congress was retaining Franklin's services in France. It's like, no, that's not what I meant. No.
Congress, you didn't get the subtext of my letter.
Someone should stay in France. By the way, I'm settling in well.
Yeah. And my son speaks French.
My son speaks French and he can fence. So, unfortunately, that didn't work out. So, on June 17th, John and Johnny set sail on a French frigate to return to Boston. During this journey, it was Johnny who was doing the tutoring because he taught English to the new French minister to the U.S. and his secretary.
Wow.
That's a good job for a young kid.
I know, right? let me just teach this diplomat our language. Come on. But upon their return, Johnny began to study to gain admission to Harvard College. But fate intervened once more, with Congress sending word in October that they wanted to send John Adams back to France in order to negotiate a peace treaty with the British. It's like, I just got home. Come on. I haven't even unpacked yet.
And this is a long, like you said with the storm and stuff, this isn't just taking a 8-hour flight and you're there the same day. This is taking a long time and it's dangerous.
Exactly. Well, and so he agreed, you could have just left me there, but okay. John was originally reluctant to bring his son once more, but upon the urging of the French minister to the U.S., the guy that he had tutored, he decided not only to bring Johnny, but his next oldest son as well, the 9-year-old Charles, and the three of them departed in mid-November. Now, it would be on this journey that John Quincy began to keep a diary, which was a practice that he would carry forward for the rest of his life. Now, this ship was thrown off course and ended up on the northwest corner of Spain. So the party had to proceed via land the 1,000 miles from there to Paris. So a long journey, even longer.
Gosh.
But upon their arrival, the two young men were enrolled in an academy in Passy. Now, as before, their stint here would be short, as John again found little for him to do as the British were not ready to negotiate. It's like, I came all this way, I had a 1,000-mile detour, and you really don't want to talk? Come on. But he decided him and his sons were going to proceed to Amsterdam, where John attempted to negotiate loans for the U.S. Now, when enrolled in the Latin school there, as Johnny did not speak Dutch, he may have had some Latin and French, but not Dutch, he was placed in a class with younger kids. You're like, you need to learn some of the basics. Now, due to his unhappiness at the situation, as noted by Traub, quote, for perhaps the only point in his life, he misbehaved.
He took his sword out.
I'll show you sticking me with these 5-year-olds.
Yeah.
But upon the recommendation of an American, the boys were sent to the university town of Leiden, where a tutor was engaged, quote, to spend 2 hours a day teaching the boys Latin and Greek, while Johnny studied the Old Testament in Greek on his own and attended public lectures. So this was definitely more of his speed. It's like, I taught English to the French minister to the U.S. Come on. I can do more. Now, in June 1781, the 12-year-old Johnny was charged by his father to serve as the secretary to Francis Dana, who was Adams's secretary that had just been named as U.S. minister to Russia. So he's like, why don't you go along with this guy? You can serve as his secretary. That would be a great experience for you.
So hang on, he's 12 at this time.
Yeah.
When is basically, previously he was studying the Old Testament in ancient Greece when he was, 11?
Yes.
Now at the age of 12, he's getting a job.
He's getting a job, and it's an important job because Dana spoke little French, which was the diplomatic language of the time. So
I've met 12-year-olds. I don't think they should be assigned diplomatic missions.
Maybe not.
But Johnny is ready. He's ready to go.
Who am I to judge the qualities of 12-year-old John Quincy Adams?
Yeah.
I mean, Abigail is definitely judging, but of course, because he was fluent in French at this point, it would come in handy. So the two made their way across the continent before arriving in St. Petersburg on August 27th. Now, unfortunately for Dana and his young secretary, the Russian Tsarina, Catherine, also known as the Great, had no intention of recognizing them as official diplomats in order to avoid a rupture in Anglo-Russian relations. So again, going somewhere, taking all his time and effort, and then, nope, you're not doing anything here.
And that is also a huge distance to travel as well.
Yes.
This isn't just popping over to your neighbor. This is that's a long trip.
Yes. But it did at least give Johnny an opportunity to observe the Russian political and social landscape, something that would come in handy for him later on in his life, and that we'll get to in just a bit. But by May 1782, realizing that there was no need to retain him, Dana wrote back to Adams, suggesting that Johnny be sent back to Leiden to continue his studies, and the elder Adams agreed. And so John Quincy set off on his own from St. Petersburg on October 30th. And so here we go. So at this point, he is probably 13, setting off on his own, and he stopped over in Stockholm for a bit. So the first of our Swedish connections here.
That's nice. Don't recommend any listeners to send their 13-year-olds alone to Stockholm, by the way.
Or to anywhere, really.
Yeah, or to anywhere.
Not just Stockholm.
No, it's relatively nice and safe here, but still the thought of 13-year-old John Quincy Adams just wandering the streets of Stockholm makes me a little uneasy. Do we know how he got on here? What did he do? Was it just a stopover?
So apparently he really enjoyed it because, as described by Traub, quote, for the first time he was tasting the joys of adult life with no nagging parents nearby.
Yeah, well, that could mean a great many things. But
Am I the only one who's interpreting that as maybe a taste of vodka and Swedish ladies?
I have heard stories. I haven't explored too in depth, but yes, I've heard stories that he was a 13-year-old young man in a city on his own.
You just start speaking ancient Greek to them and they're like, oh, John Quincy.
Speaking as a Swedish woman, that is the way to our hearts.
But he apparently really enjoyed his time in Stockholm. He went to Denmark. He went to Germany. But ultimately, though, he did have to make his way to the Netherlands, arriving at The Hague in April 1783, where he took up studies with a tutor. His father, meanwhile, had returned to Paris to help negotiate what would come to be known as the Treaty of Paris to end the revolution and secure American independence. But then, after doing that, John Adams joined his son in The Hague in July 1783, and they went back to Paris the next month. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't too long after they returned to France that the elder Adams fell ill, and as his doctor advised him to move out of the city in order to recover his health, they moved to, quote, a grand if somewhat decayed villa in Auteuil. In October, upon the advice of Adams's doctor, they traveled to London, where they were able to enjoy, quote, a private visit to Buckingham Palace and an opportunity, quote, to visit the House of Lords to hear King George speak at the opening of Parliament.
There you go. It's like a regular Wednesday in London.
Pretty much. For this boy from Massachusetts who's already been across Europe on his own.
Yeah. It's insane. Yeah.
Now, with his father's continued ill health, in December they went to the resort of Bath. But unfortunately, their rest was interrupted when an urgent message came from the United States that they were in desperate need of another loan. So on January 5th, father and son were on their way back to Holland. Now, John Quincy stayed with his father until June when he returned to London and, as instructed by his father, quote, attended Parliament in order to hear the great orators of the day.
This teenager is just living, even for the time, it must have been quite a bizarre life.
Yeah. Just go and listen to Parliament. Go.
Yeah, child labor was common at the time, but it was mainly, I guess, like chimney sweeping and milking cows, not taking notes and teaching diplomats languages.
But this is the life of John Quincy, and it just keeps going because he ping-ponged back to The Hague to be with his father at the end of the month, then returned to London in July to greet his mother and sister who had journeyed across the Atlantic to join them in Europe. So the family is finally able to come together again because John headed back to Paris to negotiate treaties with the French, and then the rest of the family joined him in mid-August to stay at the Rennet Villa. And during this time, Thomas Jefferson, another small figure in American history.
Yeah, we've heard of him.
that guy.
I was going to say I haven't heard of him. Tell us more.
No, I feel like I've seen a History Channel documentary.
No, I was going to say there must be a podcast which goes into his career in great detail or something.
There may be a series out there by the presidencies of the United States about Jefferson.
I can imagine that exists.
But Jefferson was also serving as a diplomat in France, became a mentor to John Quincy, with the young Adams, quote, dining at his table almost every night, often in the company of luminaries like the Marquis de Lafayette or the naval hero John Paul Jones. And so this is just, imagine this experience growing up.
And having listened to that series that may or may not exist, they're still like paying for this themselves, aren't they? Because there's how they funded the diplomats was really weird back then, or didn't fund the diplomats is the main thing, really.
Yeah, and again, you think about like the logistics of trying to get money back and forth. Ultimately, they would have to keep their receipts. They had some funds that were available there, but most of the time they had to come back and kind of reconcile accounts. And either the diplomat would get paid, or if they denied some of the charges, they would have to pay the government back. It was a weird system.
Yeah.
And that's why you end up with people, it's generally at this time, people who are more well-to-do, it's easier for them to be diplomats from the United States. But Elsa, you had mentioned child labor. John Quincy was also put to work acting as his father's secretary, and they used part of the time together to prepare John Quincy for seeking admission to Harvard. So, little work, little study, go to dinner with Jefferson. Yeah. That was his life. But when his father was appointed as the first U.S. minister to London the next year, it was decided that the time had come for John Quincy to begin his collegiate career. And thus, in mid-May 1785, he bid farewell to his family and began the journey back to the U.S. So at this point, the now 18-year-old John Quincy Adams arrived in New York City that summer and dined with the president of the Confederation Congress, as you do, as well as the congressional delegations from Massachusetts and Virginia, before setting off on horseback with a traveling companion to return to Braintree before setting off for Harvard. His admission would be delayed, with the president urging him to get a tutor and, after more study, return in March. Apparently, he wasn't too impressed with his knowledge of Greek and Latin and French.
It's interesting because it's a bit reversed. Like for most of us going to university or college, that's when we sort of get out on our own and live by ourselves and travel and do all of that. He's lived life in return. He's already backpacked across Europe. Like that's not what he's going to do on his summer holiday in college. Like he's done it back to front.
Yeah, and I was thinking like it's strange how a lot of people do the similar sort of thing because, again, from my trip, like Kennedy did this. He was around Europe, wasn't he, right before World War II? And so he must have done the same sort of thing, meeting back. Yeah. Oh, let's have a meeting with someone. I'll tell you how I just went around Europe.
And again, kind of same circumstances here. His father was serving as a diplomat abroad. It really interesting. But yeah, and that kind of come down from this life trekking across Europe and meeting everybody. We'll get to something in a minute, and I'm starting to wonder if that may have had something to do with this. But, the president of Harvard told him, go back, study some more, come back. So John Quincy went to study with his uncle in Haverhill, and on March 15, 1786, he was examined by the president and faculty of Harvard and was ultimately admitted, with the young man's tuition being waived, quote, in recognition of his father's public service.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could make a comment there. It's like when people, I think it's when like famous sports people and stuff get given free cars as a sponsorship thing. It's like they're the people who don't need a free car. They can afford it.
But, it does pay to, and he may have mentioned, I helped out a bit, I served as an interpreter. I taught English to the French minister.
True. It could be seen as back payment for the services he's rendered the United States since he was about 3.
Yeah, for the child labor.
Yeah.
But Adams threw himself into not just his studies, but also the social life of Harvard, joining numerous clubs and making a point to get to know all of his fellow scholars. He also watched over his brothers, Charles and Thomas, and worked to prepare them to join him at Harvard. Now, in July 1787, John Quincy graduated from Harvard and made plans to study law under Theophilus Parsons in Newburyport. Unfortunately, this would prove to be a dark time in Adams's life, as he suffered from a paralyzing depression. He actually paused his legal studies and went to his aunt's home in Haverhill. His biographer Trobe speculates that he may have felt the pressure of the lofty expectations placed on him, not only by his parents, but also by society in general. He's obviously, everybody knows he's the son of John Adams.
Yeah, you bet. Like, that's just such enormous shoes to fill. And maybe this life that he's been living catches up to him.
Yeah. And, trying to figure out his own way, but also knowing that there are these huge, lofty expectations for him, you can understand it would be difficult.
I mean, he literally shares a name with his father. He doesn't even have his own first name. He is still John Adams. Yeah.
And so, this was a challenging time for him. Though he did recover, as soon as he returned to Newburyport, he began to struggle once more. So he went back to his parents' home in Braintree. But finally, in late March 1788, John Quincy was ready to resume his studies in Newburyport. And by July 15, 1790, he was admitted to the bar and traveled to Boston to set up his law practice. Sadly for the young Adams, this meant leaving a young lady that he had grown very fond of, called Mary Fraser. And his mother, Abigail, did everything she could to persuade him to end his attachment to Mary, as he was unable to support her financially at the time. Now, John Quincy asked Mary to consider herself engaged, but also asked to hold off on the public announcement until he was better established as a lawyer and had a larger income. Now, as you can imagine, that's not really a good prospect for her. So she said no, and the two split.
That's great. That's good agency of women at the time who, you think just, the man said something, so let's do it. But she's like, no, well, I don't care who your dad is and stuff. This isn't good for me. I'm going to say no.
Yeah. She can't be stuck in this limbo. So good for her. Well, that might have been sad. They might have really loved each other. We don't know.
Well, and John Quincy took it really hard. He had kind of a breakdown, and he spent time carousing with ladies of the evening, if you get my drift. So he kind of had a wild streak. It was like Stockholm Part 2.
I was just gonna say,
But he comes back. He finds his path, and especially when he reads Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man in early 1791. So he reads this, and beginning in June of that year, he wrote a series of letters using the pseudonym Publicola, the quote-unquote friend of the people, attacking Paine as well as the new French government while defending the English Constitution. Now, it was thought by many that these letters had been written by his father, who at this point was Vice President John Adams, and even Jefferson and Madison believed that it was the elder Adams who wrote these letters. They eventually found out that no, it was John Quincy, but it speaks to the quality of them that they thought his father, of course, had to be the one writing them.
And that was a whole big thing during this period. All these anonymous, everyone was writing letters to newspapers and things that were just putting out whole, not just, I think the street lights on this street should be changed or something, but really big, almost groundbreaking political ideas and sort of messages were put out in anonymous letters, which is just an interesting way of communicating.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, like we know who wrote some of them, and some folks were, yeah, of course I wrote that, but some are still kind of mysteries. And this one, it stayed a mystery for a bit, but when they finally figured out, it's like, oh, that's John Quincy. Wow. Mm-hmm. Okay. But he got into this pattern. In late April 1793, then again in November and December, John Quincy picked up his pen once more to defend President Washington against the machinations of the French minister to the U.S., Edmond Charles Genet. another name that frequent listeners of the podcast, if you listen to the Washington series, the Genet affair was a big deal. And this younger Adams was involved in that. Now, his career path would shift away from the law in late May 1794 when he was named by President Washington as the U.S. minister to the Netherlands.
Can we circle back to how old he is at this time? I come across as a bit ageist, but...
At this point, because he was 18, so now he must be 28? 27.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, 27. That is, certainly I know, the Netherlands is an important place at this time, but you can still get ambassadors nowadays that are that young for smaller countries and stuff, but it's not outrageous.
No, that wasn't like he wasn't 12. I know it's young, but no, it's not crazy.
Mm.
Well, and that's the thing, like at this time, he was still seen as being young for that position, but also he's really starting to make a name for himself. Folks are really starting to respect him. And obviously you've got George Washington who's vouching for you. Wow.
Yeah.
And sort of he's been there before.
He's like, oh, that place. Yeah.
Whereas, all the other people, go to where? And they have to get out their map and book and stuff. Whereas, at least he's been there.
Yeah. He has friends. He has connections. He's fine. But he wasn't happy about this appointment initially because he was concerned that it would be seen as nepotism due to his father being vice president. But after receiving assurances that the appointment had been made in consideration of his abilities rather than as a favor to his father, John Quincy traveled to Philadelphia for a briefing by Secretary of State Edmund Randolph. And then on September 17th, Adams set sail for The Hague, accompanied by his brother Tom, who would act as his secretary. So keeping it in the family. Hey.
I bet that went over as a treat for the baby brother. Like, hey, come over and be my, number two.
I've done this before. It's not hard.
You can do it, but I am going to critique you. Don't worry, critiquing will happen. But this was also the day that he resumed keeping his journal once more, which was an indication that despite his reluctance to accept the post, it was an important point in his healing. He had been kind of struggling, trying to find his way, and now he had a new career. A month and a half later, the Adams brothers arrived in the capital of the Netherlands, only to find the nation being dominated by France, who had invaded earlier in the year as part of the French Revolutionary Wars. And indeed, only a few months after their arrival, the U.S. minister would witness the establishment of the Batavian Republic, which was a French client state, in place of the Dutch Republic. Now, Adams would find himself being, quote, accorded the elaborate respect due to the representative of the American Republic by the French officials now governing the nation, but he would find little business to occupy his time in this posting. Thus, he spent a good deal of time writing letters and collecting his observations of officials and leaders that he encountered. But he was also able to send updates back to the government in Philadelphia about the conflict between Britain and France. He's right there. He's getting more information than they're able to get on the other side of the Atlantic. And as noted by Traub, quote, Adams was not generally disposed toward either France or England, but also not apathetic to either. So his observations were seen as being more objective than those by other American diplomats on the continent, including the pro-French U.S. Minister to France, James Monroe, a guy that's going to come up a little later. But even when Adams was being more candid in letters to his father, the vice president made a habit of sharing those letters with President Washington. And as the young man had already made an impression on the chief executive, they were taken seriously by him. So he was giving this information on the ground that was going to the president. And Washington wrote to the vice president about how John Quincy's letters, quote, disclose much important information and political foresight, and urged that the young diplomat not follow through with a previously expressed desire to leave the nation's service after 3 years. He's like, no, we need you there.
Yeah, and the president, whilst, there is, nepotism and stuff in essentially every society, the fact that he wants him to stay, he's not going to want someone to stay just if they're terrible.
Yeah. just because I know your dad.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So in mid-October 1795, Adams received a request from the new Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, to proceed to London to be present for a formal ratification of Jay's treaty, as Jay had already journeyed back home and the U.S. Minister to Britain, Thomas Pinckney, was away. Now, this time in London would change John Quincy's life forever, because around New Year's, he began to call at the home of the U.S. consul in London, Joshua Johnson, which allowed him to spend time with Johnson's 3 daughters. He ultimately took to the 21-year-old Louisa the most. Of course, we'll learn more about her early life in her episode of the John Quincy Adams series, but for now, just know that she had been born in London and had spent her entire life in Europe despite her father's American background. So, like John Quincy, but even more so, she has this unusual background for an American at the time.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting what kind of just little things that she would have picked up, and how American, quote terms, she would seem to John Quincy.
Yeah.
Well, I think this echoes through the time. I know some people, both kind of friends and family members, that grew up abroad, or whose parents were either in the military or diplomats, and to quite a large extent, they've actually met partners with a similar background. So I think there is something to be said about maybe not feeling like partners, someone who'd just grown up in one place. Easier to relate to each other, maybe now and then.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, like, you think about John Quincy and just this remarkable life he's had already. And oh, by the way, we've still got much more to come. But, being able to find somebody that could actually understand what it was like for him, that's rare. And so it's understandable that why they would have come together. Now, he did hesitate for a few months before Mrs. Johnson forced the issue, but in mid-April, he proposed to Louisa. By June 1796, Adams had returned to his post at The Hague and engaged in his continued studies, including learning Dutch and Italian. So while he's trying to figure things out, he's like, maybe I need to learn a couple more languages.
It's amazing.
But though John Quincy thought of retiring from the diplomatic service, marrying Louisa, and returning to the U.S., in early August, he learned that President Washington had appointed him as U.S. Minister to Portugal.
It's a chance for a new language.
Yeah. I don't know that one yet, so why not? Now, in making preparations to take up this new post, Adams ultimately concluded that he would have to hold off on marrying Louisa. When she suggested that her father, in his role as a merchant, planned to send a ship to Holland and that they could journey to visit with him, Adams thought it was a ploy to pressure him into marriage, and he became furious, asserting that marriage now would be, quote, an act of folly. So he's like, yeah, we're going to get married at some point. Don't pressure me. I feel like you're pressuring me. Don't do it. But it seems that after this exchange of letters, John Quincy had a change of heart, as he planned to travel to London first to marry Louisa before proceeding to Portugal. However, on June 29, 1797, he and his brother Tom were waiting for a ship to transport them when William Vans Murray, who was Adams's replacement as U.S. Minister to the Batavian Republic, arrived and informed him that the new president, otherwise known as John Quincy's father, had decided to name him as U.S. Minister to Prussia rather than sending him to Portugal.
Wow.
Could it just all have been a mix-up of, like, they both start with P's? Oh, Portugal. No, Prussia. Paris. We don't know.
Pick one.
Pick one. Yeah.
I mean, they're the same thing, right?
It's all
over there somewhere. But again, John Quincy, and especially considering that this was coming from his dad, worried that he would be perceived to be gaining advantage through nepotism rather than his abilities, but he finally agreed to accept the posting in order to fulfill his father's wishes, and also as he thought no one would see this new post as a greater advantage to John Quincy than the post in Lisbon. He was like, I could have gone to Portugal, and instead you're sending me to Prussia. Yeah, nobody's going to envy me that. They don't even know where it is. They think it's close to Portugal.
Yeah. They're probably neighbors. Yeah.
But with Joshua Johnson having made arrangements for his travel, John Quincy made his way to London, and on July 26th, he and Louisa Catherine Johnson were married at All Hallows Barking Church. Now, as he awaited instructions from the State Department and worked to make arrangements for this new posting, John Quincy moved into the Johnson household in order to save expenses from a longer stay in London than he had originally intended. Unfortunately, the stay also revealed to Adams the extent of his new father-in-law's indebtedness and his urgent need to leave Britain in order to escape creditors.
Oh, lovely. The bailiffs are knocking on the door in the morning.
You couldn't have mentioned that, all these creditors were standing outside wanting money before he got married?
Excuse me, Governor. I think you owe me money.
And on the early morning of September 9th, the Johnsons quietly left the country. And so, of course, the creditors were now hounding John Quincy, demanding that he repay Johnson's debts.
It's not me.
It's not me. This is not a good time. First, he loses out on going to a nice Mediterranean place, and he ends up in eastern part of modern day Germany, and now he has to deal with his father-in-law's financial troubles. He's poor John Quincy. I feel like he was missold, both in his professional and personal life.
And then they say, oh, sorry, I'm not the person who owes you money. It's like, oh, who are you? It's like, oh, I'm the son of the American president. Oh, so you still have money, right?
You've still got money somewhere. Just give it to us. Well, as you can imagine, he was ready to leave London at this point. So finally, on October 19th, John Quincy, Louisa, Tom, and their servants departed from London. And on November 7th, they arrived in Berlin for John Quincy to assume his new post. But before he could focus on his new responsibilities, he had to deal with a personal crisis. This is not a good time for John Quincy. Unfortunately, his wife's pregnancy was not going well, and after suffering for weeks, Louisa unfortunately lost the baby. While the Adams family was dealing with their personal loss, they learned that the Prussian king had passed away, and his son, Frederick Wilhelm III, who was only 3 years younger than the 30-year-old Adams, was assuming the throne. So this is an interesting time, and in some ways it's an advantage. He's got somebody that he can relate to. They're pretty much of the same age. And indeed, when Adams made his first appearance at court, he received a warm reception, and he would find his responsibilities in Berlin much more time-consuming than those in The Hague had been, which John Quincy loves to stay busy. He may have to not learn another language for a few moments.
He needs to uninstall Duolingo.
Actually do some proper work. And Berlin is one of my favorite cities in Europe. So they're in a fun city. I don't know how fun it was in the late 1700s, but it's great today.
Absolutely. Well, and it's just interesting. And, we'll see. He's got a couple more capitals to go to just yet. But he soon learned that his father's intent in sending him to Prussia rather than Portugal, he realized that they were two separate countries, was to observe the state of Northern Europe and what the future state of the political landscape of the continent was to be in light of French victories in Italy. John Quincy gladly acted as his father's eyes and ears in Europe, and was instrumental in providing the president intelligence from on the ground in order to help guide foreign policy back home. Now, towards the end of 1798, John Quincy allowed his now 26-year-old brother Thomas to leave his service as a secretary, and Tom returned home. I guess you can finally go home and, start your life.
Yeah.
While Tom had proven to be a trusted partner for the diplomat abroad, their brother Charles back in the U.S. had proved less reliable. John Quincy had given him money to invest while he was away, but Charles ducked the issue when questioned about it. Then John Quincy asked his brother to look for a home for him to purchase as a rental property and heard nothing. So when Tom was heading back to the U.S., John Quincy was like, why don't you check on Charles and that money I gave him? So with Tom's return to the States, John Quincy transferred his remaining funds to Tom, while Charles, who had, in fact, lost his brother's investment, sunk even further into debt and drank before he died on November 30th, 1800, at the age of 30. So this was a big loss to the family. You know, everybody was upset. John Adams was gravely upset about what was happening with his son, and then when they lost him. And of course, that was in 1800, which is, of course, when John Adams lost the election. It was not a good time for the family.
That's very sad, but also seems to be a bit of a recurring theme in US presidents. My limited understanding, but there's often a sibling that doesn't do very well. I remember there's been a lot of news about the late Jimmy Carter, and I learned that he had a brother that was perhaps also dealing with alcoholism issues.
And Trump's brother, and lots of recent presidents who had brothers.
Yeah, and the same could be said about sort of members of the royal families here in Europe. There's often one...
Don't talk about Prince Andrew.
Don't mention the prince.
Don't mention it.
The Prince A names. No, but also like Princess Margaret with the late Queen. There's sort of one very responsible, very successful child, and then sort of someone who, for various reasons, don't cope as well.
Yeah, especially as we saw, like John Quincy had problems and, living up to the family name and all that kind of stuff. So you can see how in some cases they're not able to turn the corner and sort things out.
Yeah, because that's the thing. I mean, his brothers are under the same pressure that he was. A little less because they were the younger brothers, but still there was a great deal of pressure on them. You're Adamses. You need to.
Yeah.
And, he struggled and could not live up to that. Meanwhile, Louisa continued to suffer greatly during their time in Berlin. She lost 3 other children to miscarriages. So it was not a good time for her. But on April 12th, 1801, she successfully carried through her pregnancy to full term, and their first son, who was named George Washington Adams, was born.
He's seen both himself and his brother struggle for having a famous name, and so he said, what can we do for our son? Oh no, George Washington Adams. He'll be fine.
Now, I will say John and Abigail back home were not too happy that the first son was named after George Washington. There's another guy who was president. You may know him. Couldn't you have named your first son after him? But he now has a son, and the Adamses have a grandson. But that year would also bring John Quincy's recall orders from his father. That was one of his last acts as president before losing his re-election bid, because Abigail and John both were like, we miss our son. We want him home. We're having to go into retirement. We want him back. And at this point, they haven't even met their daughter-in-law. So on July 17th, John, Quincy, Louisa, and baby George left from the port of Hamburg to return to the U.S. They landed in Philadelphia on September 4th. And while Louisa and the baby journeyed south so that she could be reunited with her family, John Quincy made his way to Quincy to see his parents, which, of course, Louisa's side of the family, when they left Britain, they actually came back to the U.S. when they snuck out in the early morning. Now, the younger Adams would use the next few weeks to become reacquainted with his old friends and colleagues and try to figure out what their new life in Boston was going to look like. In mid-October, he made his way back south to collect Louisa and baby George, as well as report in with the new president, that guy he knew from France, Thomas Jefferson, and he also met with some of the cabinet members. Now, after a time visiting with the Adamses in Quincy, John Quincy and Louisa settled into their new life in Boston. Now, John Quincy supplemented his struggling law practice with wise investments in real estate, business ventures, and bank stock. Because he had been away for so long, it's like he doesn't really have a law practice anymore. It's going to take time to build up, but he's not going to do that, because it wasn't long before the young Adams agreed to stand for election to political office, and in May 1802, he was elected to the Massachusetts State Senate. By the fall, he was aiming for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, but lost the race against someone who we discussed in an earlier Seat at the Table episode, William Eustis. Now, the family tragedy doesn't stop, because sadly for Louisa, the spring of 1802 brought the news that her beloved father had passed away. And she would find herself getting closer to her in-laws during this time because they would take weekend trips to Quincy. And in particular, the former President John Adams took a liking to the young woman. However, the extended family also faced challenges as the bank which held the elder Adams's assets failed, and they nearly lost their estate Peacefield, which of course is part of the Adams National Historic Park and is also an amazing house to be able to go and visit. They almost lost it. John Quincy saved the day by purchasing the majority of the estate while allowing John and Abigail the use of it for the remainder of their lives, which, of course, then it would become his property outright. So this is where the Adamses are going to be based from here on out.
And John Quincy's thinking is like, now my dad's going bankrupt and got debtors running around. And so there's probably some English guy at Louisa's dad's funeral saying, "Where's my money?" And it's just wherever he goes, there's people having problems with money.
And he's like, I haven't done anything. My brother lost my money. I've got my father-in-law who's in debt. I've got my parents whose bank failed. I'm not doing any of this. Why does this keep happening? But things would turn around. 1803 would bring happier news for the family as Louisa was pregnant once more. And on July 4th, she gave birth to their second son, who they decided they should probably name John. You know, I mean...
Also, he's born on the 4th of July, so like can't get much more patriotic than that.
Call him George the Third.
I mean, we had George Washington followed by John Adams. There we go. We got it.
Jefferson saying, what about me?
Your third one is mine. So 1803 would also give a boost to John Quincy's political prospects as one of the sitting U.S. senators from Massachusetts chose not to run for re-election. So John Quincy's name would be put in contention with Timothy Pickering, who was his father's former Secretary of State. He was a disruptive figure in Adams's administration. We talked about him in his own episode, so we won't go too much into him now. But Pickering's candidacy ultimately went nowhere. And on February 3rd, 1803, John Quincy was elected to the Senate by the Massachusetts State Legislature. Funny enough, the second U.S. Senator from the Bay State resigned a few weeks later. And guess who was chosen as his successor?
Was that? No, it wasn't. I was going to say, was it Caesar Rodney? But it wasn't. No.
It was not. It was actually Pickering.
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
Maybe
he knew.
They're like, yeah, I guess we were just talking about him. Sure, he can do it. But because Adams was elected first, he became the senior senator from the state, while the older Pickering would be his junior.
And did that mean anything in practice? Or?
It basically just, like now, like you get to pick out your desk first over this person, but it was also kind of this, status thing. Oh, I'm the senior U.S. senator, which of course his dad must have loved because him and Pickering had a big falling out and they did not get along. And indeed, John Quincy and Pickering would not prove to be close colleagues in Washington. Now, unlike most members of Congress at the time, Adams actually brought his family with him to Washington when the time came to assume his seat, and they stayed with Louisa's sister and brother-in-law in Georgetown. Now, his new colleagues in the Senate would quickly learn that Adams could not be counted on to consistently vote with one party or the other. Indeed, he and Louisa were frequent guests at the president's house, despite the animosity between the senator's parents and Jefferson. So John Adams at this point was not speaking to Jefferson, but his son was going to dinner at Jefferson's house.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just a testament of his skills as a diplomat, to be able to dine with both sides. And also nice that he brought his family with him. I wonder if, again, traces of his own childhood and that kind of separation influenced that decision. Because, yeah, like you said, that must have been quite rare at the time to place that kind of focus on having your family close by.
Absolutely. Well, and it also speaks to, because part of the reason why a lot of folks didn't is that it was expensive, to have to establish another household to be able to provide for your family. But it helped that they had, some of her family members there. They could stay with them, didn't have to worry about rent or establishing kind of their own full household. But it was also a rare thing. And, you have to wonder that, like you said, he knew what it was like to be separated from your family for so long, to have this member of your family just gone for a while. So it's nice that he was able to actually achieve that. Now, as noted by Traub, quote, within months of arriving at the U.S. Senate, Adams had become its most iconoclast member. He would not barter votes or join coalitions or make small sacrifices of principle in order to win larger victories. That is, he would not legislate. He sometimes carried principle to the point of eccentricity. So he would not compromise his principles. If he felt that something was right, he wasn't going to compromise.
It's probably all that Cato he was reading, who was a very
exactly.
similar figure.
Now, with the congressional session over on April 2nd, 1804, Adams made preparations to return to Quincy, but found that Louisa preferred to stay in the Washington area with her family. Now, while John Quincy would try to convince her, ultimately he would make the trek back to Massachusetts alone. Again from Traub, quote, the misunderstandings that separated John Quincy and Louisa would never cease to cause pain and confusion and even anger. And yet, they were deeply, irrevocably bound to one another. So their marriage would be a contentious one at times, and yet they still remained together. So, interesting.
Yeah.
In the latter part of 1804, Adams occupied himself with writing a series of essays under the pseudonym Publius Valerius, attacking what was dubbed the quote-unquote Virginia faction of the Democratic-Republican Party for their efforts towards the quote annihilation of New England's weight and influence in the Union. Now, this did not mean, however, that when some Federalists began tossing about the idea of New England seceding from the Union, that Adams would be a party to that. On the contrary, he was concerned about the influence that New England could exert in an expanded nation, but he was also pro-Union all the way. So he's like, that's a step too far. I want us to be able to have some power and prestige. I don't want us to just end up this backwater, but I also don't want to disrupt the Union.
And even people like him, they, thinking of the principle that each state only has 2 senators, was anyone at this time thinking that senators should also be proportional in terms of population, like congressmen as well?
That was part of the debate during the crafting of the Constitution. And of course, it comes up from time to time that folks are like, well, maybe we need to change that. But it wasn't really taken seriously after the Constitution was actually written.
Sure. Yeah.
But when the 1805 congressional session ended, John Quincy and Louisa both traveled back to Quincy, but they disagreed when time came to return to Washington about whether their children should join them or not. Ultimately, John Quincy would win out, and the boys remained in Massachusetts. So it's interesting that he's starting to get to the point, they're getting older, they need to stay here. Meanwhile, that same year, John Quincy received the news that he had been named as the Boylston Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory at his alma mater, Harvard. Now, the year prior, Senator Adams had been approached about the possibility of taking up the post of president of Harvard, but he declined, saying that he was not qualified.
You could argue that. Yeah.
I mean, he's got a lot of experience under his belt, but he hasn't really done anything with the college yet, except be a student.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure I could run a university because I went to one.
Yeah, sure. I've done that. I've seen the university. I've been there. Yeah. But while John Quincy was excited about this possibility of taking up this professorship, he had to write to the chairman of the Harvard Corporation and Board of Overseers about the logistics of taking up the post, knowing that he would be busy with his responsibilities in the Senate for half the year. Oh, by the way, this is Senator Adams. Though it would take some time, they were able to work out the details, and on June 12, 1806, he was installed to the professorship. Sadly, that summer, Louisa, who had remained in Washington due to her being pregnant and not wanting to risk the strain that travel would put on the baby, she lost that child. So, but, they do have the 2 boys at least. But as noted by Traub, quote, John Quincy and Louisa were often separated during the latter years of Adams's tenure in Washington, either because she was in Washington during the summer or because she remained in Quincy with the children over the winter when he returned to the capital. So we're kind of having that pattern start over again of separation. Now, meanwhile, Senator Adams increasingly found himself taking the side of the Democratic Republicans in the debates of the day. When, on July 10th, 1807, he attended a meeting called by Massachusetts Democratic Republicans to discuss the response to the Chesapeake Leopard affair and the growing threat of British impressment of American sailors, the rumor mill took off that he had formally switched to that party from his previous alignment with the Federalists. So he's cozying up with these Jeffersonians quite a bit. They're getting concerned. Meanwhile, the Adams' third surviving child, a son named Charles Francis, was born on August 18th, 1807, though it would prove to be a difficult childbirth, with John Quincy worrying that either mother or son, or both, would not survive the process. But thankfully, they did. They both recovered, and they recovered enough to accompany him back to Washington in mid-October for the congressional session called early by Jefferson to address Anglo-American relations. Just as before, Adams would find himself embraced by the Democratic Republicans and shunned by the remaining Senate Federalists. The Democratic Republican leadership named Adams to key committees in that session, including to serve as a chairman of a, quote, committee considering a bill to exclude British warships from American ports. He would also support Jefferson's embargo when it came before the legislative body, and as he was still technically a Federalist, he was the only Federalist to do so. In late January 1808, he would also become the only Federalist invited to attend the Democratic-Republican Congressional Caucus to determine a nominee to succeed the retiring Jefferson. Adams even received a vote for vice president at this caucus. So that whole Federalist thing, that is kind of wearing thin. It's like you're really not a Federalist anymore.
Yeah, you're not coming to our meetings. Other people from the other party are trying to elect you for things.
Yeah, the writing's on the wall here. You can't pretend to be a Federalist anymore.
Well, and we even had his mother writing to him, questioning his decision to attend this nominating caucus. He received numerous anonymous letters decrying his cozying up to the Democratic Republicans, but he's John Quincy Adams. He's going to do what he wants. But Federalist leaders in Massachusetts went on the attack, and Adams picked up his pen and wrote an open letter to Harrison Gray Otis, who was a friend and Federalist leader, defending his decisions as well as his support of the embargo. But even though this defense was well distributed, the former President Adams warned him that it would not be enough to persuade the majority of New Englanders who were opposed to the embargo due to the damage it was doing to the region's economy. And Adams at this time was denounced in newspapers as, quote, a party scavenger who was, quote, associating with the assassins of his father's character. He was dubbed, quote, one of Bonaparte's senators.
Oh.
So it is really heating up for him. And when he returned to Boston in the summer of 1808, he found himself ostracized by society, including by his former law teacher. Like, everybody is against him at this point. The Massachusetts legislature took the extraordinary step at the end of May of appointing James Lloyd Jr. as Adams's successor when Adams's term ended the next year. So this is well beyond his term is actually over, and they're saying, no, there is no way we are electing you. Here's the guy who's going to replace you. Get the seat warm for him.
Wow. Yeah. And it's strange when, well, it was not strange because the circumstances make sense, but when bipartisanship and compromise and things, even back then, there's such a he's not massively saber rattling for one side or the other. He sort of generally seems to be somewhere in the middle, and that just is so what you're not 100% on this side or that side. So who would do such a thing?
John Quincy Adams.
Yeah.
Well, and at this point, it was clear the Federalists were done with him. So Democratic Republicans started talking to him, hey, why don't you run for the House as one of us? But it would have meant that he was running against one of the few Federalists who were still on speaking terms with him. And so he declined the offer. He also passed on the idea of running for governor. So at this point, he's just like, I'm just staying out of it for now. Let me focus on this legal career for a little bit, at least. Because in late January 1809, Adams traveled to Washington, D.C. to make arguments in a case before the Supreme Court, which this meant that Adams was on hand to witness Congress repealing the Embargo Act on March 1st and adopting a measure that he had recommended, a more focused non-intercourse act to restrict, quote, trade to British and French ports. So he's like, why don't we really make it clear we don't want to ban trade with everybody? Our problems are with Britain and France, so why don't we just restrict trade with Britain and France?
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds vaguely sensible.
I know, right? Now, this also meant that he was there to accept an invitation on March 6th from the newly inaugurated president, James Madison. When Adams arrived, he was informed that Madison was nominating him as U.S. Minister to Russia. So, as we discussed in the Madison presidency series, Russian Tsar Alexander was eager to establish stronger relations with the U.S. and was sending his own diplomatic emissary to Washington. As noted by Traub, quote, Russia was the most powerful nation in the world with whom the United States had not yet established diplomatic relations, which, of course, Adams was probably like, well, we tried. We went there. You didn't talk to us.
I was literally there. Me.
But there was a problem. The Senate did not feel that a U.S. minister to Russia was needed. They're like, we realize Russia's a thing. We're not really sure where it is. It's over there somewhere, but I think we're good. So they voted against establishing a new diplomatic mission there. So Adams returned to Boston. But his respite from service would not last for long because on July 4th, while attending an Independence Day celebration at the Massachusetts State House, he learned that the Senate had had a second vote and confirmed him as U.S. Minister to Russia. It's like, I was just there. Why couldn't you have done it then?
He was like, are you sure it's not Prussia, it's Russia?
Can we verify?
Get it right this time. I am sick of being like pinballed across Europe because you guys don't know.
But when John Quincy informed Louisa of this, she was not pleased because, especially when he told her that he had already planned for their oldest sons, George and John, to stay with relatives in Massachusetts. They were going to take Charles Francis. He was still young, but the older sons, he's like, we need to leave him here. He also decided to take his nephew, William Steuben Smith, to serve as his private secretary. So find another family member to drag into this.
Also, I feel like I have to stand up for Louisa here. Like, your husband just comes home and you're like, honey, we're moving to Russia. I was like, oh, and by the way, I've decided that 2 of the kids are staying here. My nephew is coming. It's a poor woman just having her husband, make these major life changes.
Well, and you have to wonder because Louisa's younger sister, Kitty, was also invited to join them. And so you have to wonder if she would kind of negotiate, okay, if we're doing this, I'm going to have my sister with me. Yeah. I need somebody.
Yeah.
They finally worked it out. And so on August 5th, the party departed from Massachusetts bound for Russia. We're going to leave off the story of John Quincy Adams' life and career here for now. Please be sure to join us for part 2 of JQA's 3-part Seat at the Table episode. Special thanks to Elsa and Chris for joining me for this episode. And be sure once this episode is done to check out both A Flat Pack History of Sweden and Kingdom. both of which are excellent podcasts and are on my regular rotation. Both podcasts are available wherever fine podcasts can be found, but I'll also have a link on the page for this episode on my website, which is presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find sources used for this episode, past episodes of the podcast, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidency's podcast. If you'd like to support on a regular basis, you can become a patron at patreon.com/presidencies. All patrons receive access to an ad-free feed for the podcast, which also contains patron-exclusive episodes. Right now, we're covering the lives and legacies of the Postmasters General of the early Republic. And if you thought that the post office was all about stamps and P.O. boxes, think again. As we're already seeing, Postmasters General were involved with plans on how to build the nation, to scheme for political maneuvering, and to educate the citizenry. If you'd rather just do a one-time donation, there are a couple of options to do so, including fulfilling the request on my research book wish list. I also appreciate folks taking a moment to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else that allows you to do so. It's a quick and easy way to let folks know why they, too, should be listening to Presidencies. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow me on social media if you don't already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon at Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
The land has been thrown into disorder.
Are you feeling a touch lost right now? Like global institutions don't work and politicians aren't collaborating to solve the world's most pressing issues?
There is this big space of disorder, and we're just kind of holding up our hands and going, well, don't know what we could do.
Then the Disorder Podcast is the right place for you. My name is Jason Pack. I worked in D.C. during the first Trump administration, lived in Libya during the revolution against Gaddafi, been kidnapped twice in Syria, so it's fair to say that I've lived through just a wee bit of disorder. So I want to work on understanding, how did we get to here? Why is the global enduring disorder spreading? And more importantly, how do we restore a semblance of order to our mad, 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 mad world?
Democracy has to be defended every single day in a proactive way.
Search Disorder in your podcast app to listen right now.